Barbara had seen tragedy up close, barely surviving a two-car collision that took a man's life. And so in this darkest hour of my life, I called her, because I wanted to talk to someone who knew the Lord as I did. I needed that strength. We cried and prayed over the long-distance telephone lines. By now the sun was up, and still there was no official confirmation. But aviation officials and rescue workers knew from their calculations what we knew in our hearts, that it was impossible for anyone to survive a headlong plane crash into the side of a mountain. It would not be until late in the morning that we finally got definite word. A lot of rumors and misinformation have been printed about the early morning events of March the 16th, 1991. What follows is, I hope, the most complete account yet that anyone has been able to construct of what happened that night. The twin-engine Hawker jet left San Diego at 1:41 a.m. The National Weather Service reported conditions as clear with a calm wind, roughly 3 minutes after departure, about 8 nautical miles from Brown Field. According to the National Transportation Safety Board report, released months after the tragedy, the crash occurred on the western slope of Otay Mountain, about 172 feet from the summit. It was clear that the pilot obviously had no idea that a killing peak lay in his path. There were no lights on the rural mountain. How could two such experienced pilots fly into the side of a mountain? Fans and family have asked me that question, but no more than I have asked it myself. The records of the medical examiner show that the autopsies of the pilot and co-pilot reveal no evidence of physical incapacitation or impairment that would have been causal to the accident. Instead, the National Transportation Safety Board reports a fatal series of mishaps leading up to the crash. First, before the pilot could take off, he had to file a flight plan based on instrument flight rules called IFR, meaning that he would be under the direct supervision and guidance of an air traffic controller. He called a flight service specialist at nearby Montgomery Field to file his plan, wondering how long it would take to go through and hoping he could avoid a long wait. During their conversation, it was suggested the pilot could take off whenever he wanted if he used visual flight rules, meaning he would not be guided by the tower, but instead would be responsible for knowing about and avoiding any obstacles in the terrain which were in his flight path, and then obtain his IFR clearance while in the air. The pilot elected to go that route, a decision not all that unusual for a private plane. Second, until the pilot came under the supervision of the tower, he would be forbidden to fly into San Diego's terminal control area called TCA. TCAs, in theory, make flying safer by separating faster aircraft like his jet from slower aircraft. So apparently trying to avoid entering into this TCA before he received clearance from the tower, the pilot radioed the flight service specialist twice more. According to the transcripts, the specialist confirmed that the pilot's proposed plan would put him into the TCA without clearance. The pilot then said, "So I would be better off if I headed right northeast and stayed down below 3,000 feet?" "Yeah, sure, that'll be fine," said the specialist. Later, Jim Miller, supervisor of the Federal Aviation Administration's effectiveness system, suggested that when the pilot mentioned 3,000 feet, he might have meant 3,000 feet above sea level, while the specialist apparently thought the pilot meant 3,000 feet altitude, which would have put him several hundred feet higher. The miscommunication would be deadly. Back at the hotel, we were packing to leave San Diego. There was nothing left for us to do there, and a tremendous amount of work lay ahead of us in Nashville. By noon, the hotel security personnel escorted us out of the building through a back way, and we were able to evade the press. Narvel and I were running on adrenaline when our plane touched down in Gallatin. We had been awake for many hours and had no idea when we would rest again. We drove straight home, and I took Shelby in my arms as soon as I got in. He had just turned 1. Holding his warm little body was such an affirmation of life, a comfort I really needed right then. Then Narvel and I went to see the families, starting with Jim's wife, Debbie Hammond. From Debbie's, we went to see Dana McVickers, Michael Thomas's wife. It was late when Narvel and I got back to our house. We went from home to home again the next day. By the time that long, terrible weekend was over, we were emotionally and physically exhausted. On Monday, March the 18th, my Starstruck Entertainment offices opened for the first time since the accident. The telephones were ringing as my people walked in at 9 a.m. The answering service was jammed with calls that had come into our office over the weekend. Our staff set to work, returning calls, fielding press requests, communicating with the coroner's office and the sheriff's department in San Diego, and talking with the families about funeral arrangements. Narvel and I decided that we would organize a memorial service in Nashville to honor all 8 of our friends as well as the 2 pilots. I am so proud of how tirelessly everyone worked for our loved ones. The word overtime was never mentioned. People in my office would be hurrying and planning one minute, and then someone would fall into tears the next. All of us pressed on. In the meantime, preparations for the memorial service were going on. We met with the police department, we met with the church staff. We talked about who would handle the music and who would handle the security. We arranged to release pictures of the deceased to the press. And then, Narvel and I wanted to find someone in the entertainment industry to speak at the service. I thought for a long time about who could relate to our tragedy, someone who had been through all kinds of rough times. Then it came to me, the man in black, Johnny Cash, who had virtually seen it all. I didn't know he had buried his mother a week before to the day, but God bless him, he said he'd do it. On Wednesday, March the 20th, shortly after noon, a convoy of 12 limousines carrying the families, Narvel and me, Narvel's parents, and my starstruck family, made the long journey to Christ Church in Brentwood. A crowd of about 2,000 people had gathered at the church. Reverend Dan Scott, one of the pastors at Christ Church, read from Psalms 91, my favorite chapter in the Bible. Then a 90-member choir raised their voices in song. When it was Johnny Cash's turn to speak, he sang "Jim, I Wore a Tie Today," about a musician attending another musician's funeral and inserting the names of the band members into the verses. He could not have chosen anything more appropriate or more uplifting. At the end of the service, Narvel and I walked to the limousine, and once inside, the dam finally broke. I think that keeping incredibly busy had been my mental leaning post for days. Now, for the first time, I could finally let those days' worth of suppressed emotion free. I cried most of the way back to my office. That helped. It released a lot of the stress and pressure. It was easier to meet with the families at the dinner we had planned for them. I probably had 24 requests for interviews within 48 hours of the crash. Jennifer Bowler, my publicist, turned them all down. But my silence didn't stop the flood of news stories. It was clear that I couldn't escape the press completely, so we decided to talk to Jane Sanderson, a reporter I trusted with People magazine. I appeared on the April 1st cover of People. It was such a private and painful period for me, but I had hoped that the interview would satisfy the public's need to know, and that I could retreat back into my life, and all of us, the families too, could begin the painful process of healing. After that, when I did do press interviews again, it was always with the stipulation that reporters not bring up the crash. I looked for solace in the place where I'd always found it before, in the Lord and in my music. A couple of days after the memorial service, I stunned the music community and myself by announcing that I would be returning to work. The question, inevitably, had come up even before we left San Diego. Mike Allen, our tour booking agent, didn't know what to do about our dates. I remember saying, "Cancel everything until July and we'll decide later." One of the dates was an appearance on March the 25th, 9 days after the crash, at the annual Academy Awards, the Oscars. The song I'd been scheduled to perform was "I'm Checking Out," which Meryl Streep had sung in Postcards from the Edge. "I'm checking out of this old heartbreak hotel," it went, and I tried to imagine myself singing it. I got to thinking that the Heartbreak Hotel was the world. That "we're checking out" was the band's way of saying, "We're not hurting, we're okay." And I just knew in my heart that if I could have discussed it with them, the band would have told me to go on and do it. It was a gut feeling, a sign of their approval. A peaceful feeling swept over me as I said, "Narvel, I'm going to do the Oscars." "Are you sure?" he said. Yes, I would do the show for the band. When I sang at the Oscars the following week, I think most of the audience knew what had happened to my band and Jim. The song took on new meaning for them like it had for me. I sang it with all my heart. Then after the Oscars, I went on the road. Needless to say, not everybody agreed with my decision. Some people accused me of being disrespectful, and others said I was hungry for money. I wouldn't have done anybody any good by laying around. There were many people depending on me, the surviving band members, my stage and production crew, many of whom had families to support. We had to put a band together in 1 week. That was barely enough time to meet, much less rehearse 6 musicians and a vocalist. Dolly Parton had called me at the office when she heard of the crash. She said if I needed anything to tell her. No wonder I've been a huge fan of hers from the beginning. I thanked her and asked her if we could use the services of Gary Smith, her band leader and record producer. He knew every good musician in Nashville. We asked him to form a band for us. No promises were made to the new musicians that they would have a job indefinitely. After what we'd been through, I don't think any of us could have made any promises. I rehearsed with the new group and immediately realized how much pressure was on them. They knew that some fans would compare them to the old band, and we all had to try to do the best job we could. It would be hard for all of us. I mentally prepared myself for that first show in Columbus, Ohio, and I was pulling for the band. Those guys held up like troopers, totally applying themselves to their playing and performing. At the end of 1991, Narvel and I had to consider what we were going to do about a band for 1992. My musical organization has a history of changing each year. It's common knowledge in Nashville that I and other entertainers add and subtract players at the beginning of each year. I think that change helps maintain a band's freshness. We asked a number of the new band members to return with us in January. The others, 6 altogether, were given ample notice, along with our heartfelt appreciation for all they